Back in the late 1800s, there was a pastor who came up with a rather creative idea for Sunday night services. He decided he was going to write a book, and so he gave them a chapter of the book each Sunday night, kind of left them with a cliffhanger each week, and after the series was all completed, came up with a title and published the book. The book sold 30 million copies to date. The title of the book was In His Steps. The subtitle was, What Would Jesus Do? Now, that idea, that concept, and really that question, what would Jesus do, got rebirthed about 100 years later. And people began to ask that question a lot. It was a question that kind of troubled me, honestly, because I looked around and I didn't see a lot of people doing what Jesus was doing. And so I asked myself the question, why is that? And I began to ponder that in light of Scripture. I went to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. There's a Christmas story in John chapter 1. It's a different kind of Christmas story. There's no nativity, there's no wise men, there's no Mary, there's no Joseph. There is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh, verse 14, and made His dwelling among us. The message says the Word became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. And then that passage goes on, the 16th verse and the 17th verse, and tells us that Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. And when I read that, not for the first time, but in light of that whole question of what would Jesus do, I began to think about, well, that's what Jesus would do. It would be that He would live a life that was full of grace and truth, and if we were going to do what Jesus would do, then we would do that as well. So here's the big question I have for you today, and that is, are you a grace person or a truth person? I don't know whether it's because of genetics or because of the way that you were brought up, but I think most of us tend to be one or the other. And interestingly enough, I think grace people tend to marry truth people, and truth people tend to marry grace people, which is probably a really, really good thing. We discovered that at our house, kind of accidentally, in a kind of way that today is humorous, but wasn't particularly humorous on the day that this originally happened. I kind of am embarrassed to admit this today, but at the time, my wife and I had an argument. And I know what Scripture says. You shouldn't go to bed with the sun going down with anger in your heart, but we apparently went to bed angry. We woke up the next day. She got up early and went to work. I didn't actually see her because she always left early for work. But it's my job to get the kids up and get them ready for school and out the door and there. And so I went about my business that day, regular routine, and everywhere I went, I began to find these little yellow Post-it notes. And on these yellow Post-it notes, there were just one letter. So I went to shave, and there was the letter S. And then I went to feed the dog, and there, taped to the dog food, was the letter L. And as I made my way through the rounds doing my chores that morning, I discovered the word slime, S-L-I-M-E. And then I remembered, oh yeah, we had a little bit of an argument last night, and evidently my wife is sending me a lovely message today. Well, typically we would talk 2 or 3 times during the day, but on that particular day we didn't talk at all. And I came in that night, and my wife greeted me. She was fixing dinner. I changed out of my work clothes and went into the kitchen, and she said, "You didn't call me today." And I said, "Well, I typically don't call people who think of me as slime." And she laughed and said something like, "You're not really very smart, are you?" And I thought, well, we're just adding to the misery here. She said, "Look at the counter." And there on the counter, she had repasted the letters in the order that they were supposed to be. She had sent me the message, smile, S-M-I-L-E. Now, on that particular day, I discovered something about grace and truth. She was extending grace to me, and I think I was receiving a little bit of truth that day. So the challenge for all of us, I think, is what do we do with grace and truth? How do we know when to extend grace and when to stand for truth? Well, again, I think we go and we look into Scripture, and we look at the life of Jesus, and we discover that Jesus had a pattern that He followed. If you look just at the Gospel of John, you'll see in John chapter 4, Jesus meets a woman at the well, a Samaritan woman. You probably remember the story. The reality was that it was grace that Jesus would even be at that well. and he talked to her. Again, another act of grace, something that didn't happen in that particular day. But if you go on in the story, you'll discover that there comes this moment where he confronts her with some truth. It's kind of some ugly truth. He says to her, "Where's your husband?" He confronted with her with the reality of her life that she didn't have a husband, or at least she was on her fifth husband at the time, and that was one of the reasons why she was at the well in the middle of the day. So we see in that pattern Jesus extending grace, but having a moment where he stands for truth. John, the 5th chapter, the very next chapter over, there's a man that is needing healing. And Jesus heals him. That was the act of grace, but there comes a moment in that conversation with him where he says to him, "Stop sinning." Flip over a few more chapters. John chapter 8, you remember the story, the woman that was caught in the act of adultery and brought before Jesus. And Jesus says, "Where are those that condemn you?" And they had all gone at that point, and he said, "Then neither do I condemn you." That's grace. The truth was, he says to her, "Go and sin no more." A few more chapters over, John chapter 13. One of the most interesting ones to me, because we see Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. Wouldn't be too long, and there would be another person that would be washing his hands. His name was Pilate. Washing his hands, the man who asked, "What is truth?" Well, Jesus demonstrated for his disciples in that moment what grace was by washing their feet. But there came a truth moment with Peter when Peter said, I don't want you to just wash my feet, I want you to wash my hands as well. And Jesus says, "If you don't allow me to wash your feet, then you'll have no part of me." That was a truth moment in Peter's life. Well, that's not a new concept. I mean, the reality of Scripture is that for years and years and years, God had been conveying to us this concept of grace and truth. We need both grace and truth, but it's grace at the right moment and truth at the right moment. You may remember the story of Jonah. Jonah is most often talked about in relationship to a whale or a really large fish. What people often forget about is that there's a worm in the story as well. Now contrast the size of a whale and the size of a worm. I would make the case that the whale was God's grace in Jonah's life, and the worm became God's truth in Jonah's life as he revealed the prejudice that he had in his heart. So grace and truth. Are you a grace person or are you a truth person? This all becomes, I think, real for us when we start thinking about how we interact with people that we live with, how we talk to people that we work with, and how we try and have the wisdom and the discernment to know, do they need grace or do they need truth? Now, I will tell you, there have been a lot of times in my life when what I really needed was truth and somebody gave me grace. And then there have been some other times in my life when what I really needed was grace and all I got was truth. Jesus gives us a pattern, and the pattern was, if you're in doubt about grace or truth, lead with grace. I see that in every single story of Scripture, every interaction that he had. But then there comes a moment in each of those stories where there is the truth moment as well. So we look at grace and truth, and we can't look at them separately. I think they are the ultimate dynamic duo. They have to go together. Our world, I believe, is desperate for people that will be full of grace and they'll be full of truth. I close with one of my favorite quotes. It comes from a man by the name of Jerry Bridges. He says, "On your worst days, your very worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace. And on your very best days, you're never beyond the need for God's grace." May we be people of grace and truth.